In the spring of 1857, a cotton broker named William Thorne left Charleston for a short inspection trip through the heart of Georgia. He had made this journey a dozen times before, reviewing plantation ledgers, confirming yields, and checking the health of trade routes. But what he stumbled across that April would haunt him until the day he died. Something buried so deep in the red clay of Georgia that when it finally came to light, it nearly unstitched the social fabric of an entire state. He'd been reviewing records at a modest property called Moss Creek Plantation, tucked between the Oconee River and the county road that wound its way toward Augusta. The place was unremarkable compared to the grand estates that defined the southern image. No white columns, no sweeping veranda, just a simple two-story house surrounded by slave cabins and fields of cotton. But when Thorne opened the accounting ledgers, he noticed something peculiar. Over 15 years, Moss Creek had sold 23 male slaves. That wasn't unusual. What was strange was the price. Each man had been sold at a rate far higher than market value, sometimes double. And next to each name, neatly written in the margin, were two words: prime condition certified. At first, Thorne assumed it was simply good business. Maybe the owner had better stock or more disciplined management. But as he flipped through the records, a chill crept over him. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate. The same kind of men, the same ages, the same brief window of ownership. It was as if someone had been selecting them according to a design only they understood. What Thorne couldn't have known then was that those words, prime condition, certified, hid one of the darkest secrets in Georgia's history. A secret so meticulously recorded, so carefully concealed, that when it finally surfaced, it would shake the foundations of every respectable family in the state. The estate's owner was a widow named Eleanor Creswell. Her husband, Thomas Creswell, had died suddenly in 1840 of what the local doctor called apoplexy, likely a stroke. Eleanor inherited Moss Creek at age 31, childless, alone, and with most of her family living comfortably in Savannah. Everyone expected her to sell the property and return to city life. Instead, she fired her overseer, took control herself, and transformed Moss Creek into one of the most profitable mid-sized plantations in the county within a year. Neighbors gossiped about her endlessly. It wasn't common for a woman to manage her own property, much less run it efficiently. They called her cold but competent, a woman who understood the numbers better than most men did. She was polite but distant, never attended church, never hosted parties. When asked why she didn't remarry, she would smile tightly and say widowhood had freed her from unnecessary expectations. What no one knew was that Eleanor kept 3 ledgers. The first was the public one, ordinary, routine, and always ready to be shown to auditors or curious neighbors. The second ledger contained the real profits, the accurate sales, hidden earnings, and unreported gains that ensured her wealth grew faster than anyone suspected. The third ledger was locked inside a small iron box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. That book was written in code, using a cipher she'd designed from her father's old shipping manifests in Savannah. That third ledger wasn't about business. It was about people. In it, Eleanor listed names, dates, and detailed physical descriptions: eye color, bone structure, hair texture, skin tone in different light. To an outsider, it might have looked like the private observations of a vain woman obsessed with appearances. But Eleanor wasn't measuring beauty. She was cataloging lineage. Her plantation operated differently than others. She rarely kept slaves for more than 18 months, and she purchased only young men, never women, never families. Her female slaves were older, barren, kept mostly for domestic work. Every man she bought was between 18 and 25, healthy, strong, and Selected, each arrival followed the same pattern. For the first week, the man would be separated from the others, housed in a small cabin near the main house. The field hands knew what that meant. They didn't talk about it, not even in whispers. On the 7th night, the man would be summoned to the house. No one ever saw what happened inside, but the servants noticed things. Eleanor always bathed first. She wore the same plain grey dress. A single lamp burned in her room until well past midnight, and by morning the man would return to the quarters different, quiet, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. Something had been taken from him. Afterward, Eleanor would spend hours in her study with the iron box open, writing furiously in her code. The first disappearance happened in the fall of 1843. A man named Samuel, sold to a cotton planter in Alabama, never arrived. The buyer demanded answers, and Eleanor sent copies of the bill of sale, a receipt from the driver, and an apology. Slaves escaped all the time, she explained. It was unfortunate, but not unusual. 6 months later, another man disappeared. Same story. Eleanor's paperwork was perfect. She was sympathetic, professional, untouchable. By 1847, 5 men had vanished after being sold from Moss Creek. No one noticed the pattern. Buyers were scattered across different states, and news traveled slowly. To everyone else, Eleanor Creswell was still the image of Southern respectability, an independent widow who ran a clean, efficient operation. But none of those men had ever left Georgia. Their bodies were buried in a patch of rocky soil on the edge of her property, a place Eleanor said she intended to turn into an orchard someday. She told her field hands not to plow there. The orchard never came. Every death followed the same ritual precision. After selecting a man, Eleanor observed and documented him, trained him, improved his health, made him more valuable on paper. Then, a few days before his scheduled sale, she invited him to the barn. She'd pour him a drink. Whiskey laced with laudanum, just enough to dull his strength but not his awareness. Then she would show him her ledger, explaining what she had recorded, his features, his measurements, his resemblance to certain Southern families. It wasn't random. She had been searching for specific bloodlines, and when he realized what she meant, when he understood he had been chosen not for his labor but for his likeness, she would call for her accomplice. From the shadows of the barn, a man would step forward. His name was Henry. No one in the county knew that Henry Creswell existed. According to public record, Eleanor had no children, but Henry had been born 7 years before her marriage in 1829, the son of a Savannah merchant's daughter and a dock worker her father once owned. The child of scandal, the child of shame. Eleanor had given him up, sending him north to live with an aunt in Philadelphia, but she never forgot him. When her husband died in 1840, she summoned him back under a new name, Henry Leal, a traveling merchant who sold farm equipment to plantations across Georgia. To everyone else, he was just a northern businessman, but to Eleanor, he was the living symbol of everything she despised about the Southern order. The hypocrisy of men who preached purity while profiting from sin. Henry had his mother's intelligence and his father's calm restraint. Together they made a pair that frightened even the slaves who'd long since learned to fear everything. They worked like scientists, methodical, detached. After each transaction, Henry would help her record details in the coded ledger, measurement sketches, sometimes hair samples. Every victim became part of their evidence, part of the case they were building, because Eleanor wasn't just killing. She was proving something. She had spent years researching Georgia's most powerful families, who married whom, which planters had fathered mixed-race children, which names appeared quietly on both sides of the color line. She knew every affair, every hidden child, every rumor buried in church records. When she found a young slave whose features matched one of those families, a Caldwell nose, a Mercer jawline, eyes the color of the Gaines family's gray-green, she bought him. Then she preserved the proof. In her mind, she wasn't murdering men. She was collecting evidence. By 1850, 13 graves filled the rocky edge of Moss Creek. 13 sets of measurements, 13 entries in the iron box. Each man's existence and death was meant to expose the lie that Southern society was built on. That its pure bloodlines had never been touched by the people they enslaved. But Eleanor's plan was about more than vengeance. It was about humiliation. She wanted to destroy their reputations, their names, the illusion that they were better. She wanted to show the world that the same men who preached racial superiority had sired the very blood they condemned. And to her, that meant her own son's existence. Henry's existence wasn't a stain. It was proof. She knew no court would listen. No jury of Southern men would ever condemn their peers. So she built her own form of justice, bodies instead of witnesses, bones instead of testimony, dead proof as she called it. When she looked at those shallow graves, she didn't see victims. She saw the foundation of a case strong enough to topple the system itself. But time was running out. The 1850s brought turmoil. The country was dividing. Whispers of abolition were becoming shouts. War felt inevitable, and Eleanor feared her years of work would die with her if she didn't act soon. She needed more names, more proof. Then, in the summer of 1856, a letter arrived from Boston. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Creswell, Moss Creek Plantation, and signed by Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and writer for The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. He had heard rumors, unexplained disappearances, strange bookkeeping, and he wanted answers. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, expression blank, hands still. Then she called Henry. "Someone's been talking." Henry studied the paper. "Do we stop?" Eleanor's lips curved into that familiar bloodless smile. "No," she said. "We invite him." The letter from Boston lingered on Eleanor's desk for 2 days before she touched it again. The handwriting was deliberate, masculine, the kind that belonged to men who believed their words could reshape the world. The ink had faded slightly at the edges from the damp Georgia air, but the message remained sharp. Rumors of unaccounted sales, vanishing men, and unexplained ledgers tied to Moss Creek. It wasn't accusation, it was invitation. The writer promised discretion and understanding, presenting himself as a seeker of truth rather than a prosecutor. His tone was polite, even reverent. It was the kind of letter designed to make a person lower their guard. Eleanor recognized manipulation when she saw it. It almost impressed her. The next morning, a new page appeared in her coded ledger, an entry written with precision, her script steady and graceful. Beside the name Daniel Harrington, she drew a small cross. Her method was always the same: observe, analyze, record, preserve. The Boston journalist was about to become part of her archive. When he arrived in mid-August, the air was thick with the scent of rain that never came. Dust clung to his boots, and the light cotton suit he wore marked him instantly as a man unfamiliar with southern heat. The plantation staff watched him with quiet unease. Visitors were rare, and this one looked more like a preacher than a reporter. He stayed in the main house at Eleanor's request. She moved through her home like a ghost of polished manners, speaking little, her presence enough to keep servants silent and doors closing softly behind her. Harrington, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath that calm surface, believed he was among civilized company. He spent his first days wandering the property, noting details for his story: fields, barns, the cracked remains of an old smokehouse. He asked about the missing men with a journalist's curiosity, his words wrapped in courtesy but his eyes sharp. He spoke of abolition, progress, and northern reason, unaware that every phrase deepened Eleanor's interest. That night, as cicadas screamed outside and thunder rolled far away, she worked by lamplight in her study. The coded ledger lay open beside her, its pages dense with secrets. She traced her fingers along the column of numbers and symbols that represented men who no longer existed. The arithmetic of sin, bound in leather. She was preparing to add one more. From the doorway, Henry watched her write. His face, half in shadow, carried none of the softness that once lingered in youth. Years beside her had hardened him, shaped him into the instrument she needed. There was no cruelty in his expression, just purpose. The next morning, Harrington asked to see the orchard. He'd heard about it from one of the workers. A slip of conversation that traveled quickly and quietly through the quarters. Eleanor agreed. She walked with him past the fields, parasol in hand, her movements measured and elegant. The patch of ground she called the orchard looked ordinary, thin trees scattered across uneven soil, rocks protruding like bones from beneath the earth. Harrington noted the unnatural stillness. No birds, no sound but the wind dragging through leaves. He crouched to study the ground and noticed faint depressions, roughly oval, aligned in rows. They were too symmetrical to be natural. He brushed his fingers across one and frowned at the density of the soil. It was compacted, as though pressed from above long ago. Behind him, Eleanor's shadow fell long across the ground. The parasol tilted slightly. The moment stretched thin. When he straightened, she was already walking back toward the house. That night, he couldn't sleep. Something about the orchard gnawed at him. He sat at the small desk in his guest room, writing by candlelight, filling pages with notes. About the strange ledger glimpsed through her study door, the silence among the workers, the missing names whispered in half-truths. In another part of the house, Eleanor was awake too. She stood by the window, watching lightning flicker beyond the hills. Her reflection merged with the storm, pale and unwavering. Beneath the floorboards, the iron box rested like a beating heart. She could almost hear the faint creak of the coded pages shifting with the weather. Henry entered quietly. His coat was damp, his hands streaked with dirt. He carried a folded piece of paper, something he'd retrieved from Harrington's travel case. The notes revealed everything. The reporter had already begun linking the disappearances to Moss Creek. He had names, descriptions, even a theory about the graves. Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the window as the first drop of rain hit the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, measured, calm, inevitable. The next morning, Harrington's horse stood saddled outside the stable untended. His room was empty except for the open journal on his desk, its last line half-finished. The widow, Creswell, is not. The page ended there. Locals later claimed he left suddenly, bound for Augusta. Others insisted they saw him riding north toward Atlanta, but no stagecoach carried his name, and no letter ever reached Boston again. Eleanor returned to her routines. The workers avoided her gaze. The air around Moss Creek grew heavier, as though the land itself understood that one more secret had sunk into its soil. Weeks passed. The war that everyone whispered about drew closer, a slow tide creeping up the coast. Men were enlisting, railroads were being built, and the world beyond the plantation seemed ready to tear itself apart. Yet within those weathered acres, life continued in an eerie rhythm. Cotton picked, ledgers balanced, graves undisturbed. But something inside Henry began to shift. The silence that had bound him to his mother's purpose began to feel like suffocation. Every new burial left him standing longer by the orchard fence, staring at the ground, his thoughts crawling like roots beneath his skin. He remembered the men's faces, the way fear looked just before the laudanum dulled it. He remembered the sound of shovels cutting into hard soil, and lately he had begun to hear other things. Whispers, faint, half-formed, carried on the wind that swept through the orchard at night. Sometimes they sounded like breathing, sometimes like names. Autumn came early that year, painting the fields in rust and shadow. Eleanor spent more time indoors, surrounded by papers and candlelight. Her handwriting grew smaller, tighter, her entries filling pages in a feverish rhythm. Each symbol meant something only she understood. Ratios, genealogies, bloodlines, proof. She believed she was close to completion, that the network of names and patterns she had drawn would one day vindicate her work. But the ledger was starting to betray her. Ink smeared where it shouldn't have. The cipher she'd perfected began to confuse even her. Some pages no longer matched the others. The order faltered, and when she tried to correct it, her mind stuttered. The pattern she had built began to loop back on itself, feeding her doubts. The night the fever struck, the rain returned in sheets. Lightning crawled across the fields, turning the orchard into a landscape of bones. Eleanor lay in bed, drenched in sweat, whispering numbers to the dark. Her body trembled as though something inside her was counting down. Henry sat nearby, unmoving, a lamp flickering beside him. The house felt smaller, heavier. Every board creaked like a breath. At dawn she opened her eyes for the last time. Her face had lost its tension. For the first time in years, she looked almost peaceful. When the doctor arrived, Henry stood at the foot of the bed, expression blank. The physician noted the cause as fever and exhaustion. He didn't ask questions. People didn't question wealthy widows, even in death. By sunset, she was buried on the hill behind the house. No sermon, no marker, just a plain mound of earth beneath an oak tree, within sight of the orchard. That night, the wind shifted. The hum returned, soft at first, then low and rhythmic, as though the ridge itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Henry didn't sleep. He went to her study, opened the floorboards, and lifted the iron box. Inside, the coded ledger waited, its pages still damp from her final days. The symbols danced across the paper, looping endlessly. He stared at them for hours, then without a sound, he carried the box to the orchard. The air smelled of rain and iron. He dug with bare hands, deeper and deeper until the soil gave way to softer layers. He placed the box there, covered it, and sat back against the tree, mud streaking his face. When dawn came, the first sunlight broke through the fog, revealing fresh prints leading away from the orchard and vanishing into the forest. No one ever saw Henry again. The plantation fell silent. Seasons passed, vines crept over the buildings, and the orchard grew wild. By the time the war ended, Moss Creek was a ruin swallowed by green. But sometimes travelers passing through the valley would notice strange things. A faint vibration underfoot, the sound of whispering when no one else was around, or a flicker of lamplight deep among the trees where no house should have stood. Locals avoided the place. They said the ground there wasn't just cursed, it was conscious. The earth kept count, and every secret it swallowed made the hum a little louder. By the time the war ended, the land had changed hands twice. Moss Creek became little more than a smudge on the map, its fields reclaimed by wild growth, and its house left to rot in the slow, hungry way the South forgets its sins. The Creswell name vanished from records, the ledgers confiscated or burned by Union soldiers who thought they were simple bookkeeping journals. But not everything disappeared. In 1874, nearly a decade after the war's end, a new family arrived in the valley. Their name was Weaver. They were small people in a big world, a miner, his wife, and their son, Thomas. They came from the Allegheny region, following whispers of work and a chance to start fresh. The coal companies were spreading south, buying up cheap land, promising wages and stability. For families like the Weavers, that promise was enough. Their cabin stood at the edge of what had once been the Moss Creek property, though few in town remembered it by name. The forest had grown dense, trees thick with moss, streams cutting through gullies where once cotton had thrived. From the Weaver's porch, you could see the ridge rise black and solemn against the sky, its slope scarred by the first shafts of the new coal operation. It wasn't long before the trouble began. The company men came first, 3 of them, polished boots and brass buttons gleaming even in the soot. They inspected the land, marking trees, tapping stakes into the soil. They told Jacob Weaver that the ridge beyond his home was company property now. His little patch of farm lay inside their boundary. Jacob was stubborn. He'd fought in the war, carried the scars of it, and wasn't about to give up the first real home he'd owned. The men smiled the way men do when they've already decided the outcome. They left papers on his table and promised to return with lawmen if he refused to sign. His wife, Mary, worried constantly after that. She kept Thomas close, the boy barely 12, quiet but alert, in that unnerving way children sometimes are when they understand more than they should. He spent hours watching the ridge through the trees, still as a post, eyes narrowed. Neighbors thought him strange. They said he hardly spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone older. Once when a neighbor asked what he was looking at, Thomas answered without turning his head, "The hill's not hollow. It breathes." No one knew what to make of that. By late autumn, tensions reached a breaking point. The company men returned with 2 deputies, demanding Jacob vacate the property. Mary hid inside, clutching Thomas to her chest. Jacob stood on the porch, shotgun resting against the railing. Voices rose, boots stamped the earth, and then one sharp crack. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. When the neighbors arrived, they found all 3 company men dead in the yard. One deputy wounded, raving that the boy, not the father, had pulled the trigger. Jacob stood frozen, the gun still in his hands, but there wasn't a trace of powder on him. The deputies swore Thomas had stepped forward calmly, taken aim with perfect precision, and fired 3 times without blinking. Jacob denied it. Said his son didn't even know how to load the rifle, but the surviving deputy wouldn't back down. He said the boy never flinched, never showed fear, not even when the men returned fire. He just watched them fall. The sheriff came at dawn. By then, Thomas was sitting by the fence, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes pale and steady. When asked what happened, he only replied, "They shouldn't have touched the ridge." Jacob was arrested for murder. Mary refused to let them take Thomas, insisting her husband was innocent. But when they tried to question the boy again, he just stared at the wall until they gave up. For a while, the town whispered theories: possession, madness, trauma. Some said the ridge itself had cursed the family. Others said Thomas was just clever enough to fool everyone. But then the strange part began. When the bodies of the company men were examined, the wounds didn't match Jacob's rifle. The entry points were too small, too precise, as though made by something else entirely. No weapon was ever found, and yet the killing shots had been clean, instant. Within a week, Jacob Weaver was found dead in his jail cell. The official report blamed suicide. The sheriff wrote that the man hung himself in despair. But those who saw the body whispered about the marks around his neck, not a rope burn but something thin, circular, almost like pressure from a wire or, as one doctor muttered, The tightening of an iron band. Mary and Thomas disappeared that night. Their cabin was left in perfect order, lamps trimmed, dishes washed, a loaf of bread half sliced on the table. Tracks led into the forest, ending abruptly near the ridge where the first mining shaft had been started. The search party found nothing. The company halted operations for 2 months after that. Workers claimed to hear strange noises from the tunnels, low hums that pulsed in rhythm, almost like breathing. Machinery jammed for no reason. One man swore he saw a figure standing deep inside the shaft, small and motionless, its eyes glinting in the lantern light before fading back into darkness. When the company resumed digging, a series of collapses followed. No survivors were recovered. Eventually the mine was abandoned, and the ridge was sealed again under layers of stone and timber. Years later, people would say the ground never truly settled after that. By 1890, the story of the weavers had turned into a cautionary tale. Locals told it by firelight, warning children to stay away from the ridge. Some said Thomas had died in the tunnels, trapped beneath the collapse. Others swore he still wandered the woods, unchanged, the same quiet boy, watching the hills that once breathed his name. But history, as it always does, found ways to repeat itself. In 1907, an engineer named Samuel Briggs was sent by the new West Virginia Coal Syndicate to inspect the old ridge site. Briggs was a man of logic, numbers, geology, profit margins. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in seams and strata and the mechanical heart of the earth. The locals warned him, of course. The weavers, they said. The ridge, the hum. But Briggs laughed, chalking it up to mountain superstition. He brought a small crew and began drilling test bores. On the 3rd day, a strange resonance appeared on their instruments, deep, rhythmic, pulsing from below. Briggs dismissed it as an echo from underground water movement. He ordered a deeper drill. That night the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound no one could explain. It wasn't quite a moan, nor the cry of any animal they knew. It was steady, deliberate, like something large exhaling through the layers of stone. The crew packed up before dawn. Briggs alone stayed behind. When he didn't return, a search party found his camp untouched. Tools neatly stacked, coffee still warm in the pot. His journal lay open beside the lantern. The final entry read, "Pressure below increasing." Sounds like breath. Found what appears to be bone fragments. Human. Child-sized. He was never found. By the early 20th century, the ridge was officially closed off by state order. Yet stories persisted. Miners who claimed their drills vibrated with unnatural rhythm when pointed toward the hill. Travelers who heard a child humming near the creek. Farmers who swore their soil shifted underfoot as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. Each generation dismissed it as myth, and each generation added a little more to it. Some said the boy was the ghost of the ridge itself. Others believed he was still alive somehow, preserved beneath the earth, waiting. Decades passed, and the world around Clay Hollow changed. The Great War came and went. Railroads carved through the valleys. Towns rose, then fell. The ridge remained untouched, watching. In 1936, a drought exposed parts of the old mine entrance. 2 boys exploring the area found remnants of wooden supports and an old rusted pickaxe with the initials TW carved faintly into the handle. They brought it home, showing it proudly to their families. Within a week, both fell sick with fever. Their skin turned ashen, their breathing shallow. Doctors were baffled. No infection, no known cause. They recovered slowly, but neither spoke again of the ridge. The pickaxe vanished soon after. By the 1950s, Clay Hollow had become a forgotten place. Locals moved closer to the cities and the forest grew thicker. Hunters avoided the ridge, saying their dogs went mad near it. Some nights when the air hung heavy with rain, a faint glow could be seen along the slope, white, like lantern light under water. Old men sitting outside the store would lean back in their chairs and mutter about the Weaver boy. They'd say he wasn't like other children, that he'd seen something in the ridge the rest of them couldn't, that he'd listened too closely when the ground began to hum. And sometimes, when thunder rolled low through the valley, they'd swear they heard his voice riding the echo, calm, steady. They shouldn't have touched the ridge. Time has a way of covering over history, like leaves gathering on forgotten graves. But in the Appalachian hills, the past doesn't stay buried. It just breathes slower. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Clay Hollow existed only in county records and ghost stories. The last road leading toward the ridge had been reclaimed by vines and runoff, and the old mine shafts were nothing more than narrow scars hidden by roots and ferns. Still, there were always a few who felt drawn there. One of them was a young geologist named Helen Price. She'd grown up hearing her grandfather talk about the Weaver boy and the humming hill. He told the story not as a tale of ghosts, but as a kind of warning that the land remembers everything. Helen dismissed it as superstition until she found the name Moss Creek buried in a century-old survey. The coordinates matched the ridge. It intrigued her. She convinced the State Geological Office to let her conduct a small study on unmapped seismic anomalies. Her proposal sounded scientific enough, and funding came through quickly. She packed her truck with equipment, maps, and a reel-to-reel recorder, heading into the mountains with 2 assistants. The locals at the general store tried to dissuade her. They told her about the humming, about tools that vibrated without reason, about miners who swore the ground pulsed under their boots. She smiled politely and made notes. Superstition was data after all. When they reached the ridge, the air grew still. Even the insects quieted, as if the forest itself were listening. Helen's assistants set up camp near the edge of the overgrown orchard. To them, it was just a patch of trees. They didn't know that beneath the soil lay a ledger of graves stretching back to Eleanor Creswell's time. The first night passed quietly. The second didn't. Around midnight, the instruments began to pick up rhythmic tremors, steady, measured, repeating every 11 seconds. At first, Helen assumed it was mechanical interference. She checked the seismograph twice. The reading was clean. The pulses came from deep underground, far below any mine shaft they knew existed. When she adjusted the frequency range, the pattern changed slightly, like breath shifting in sleep. Her assistant, Mark, thought it was fascinating. He leaned close to the microphone, listening. The recording played back faintly through static, a low, rolling vibration, constant and human-like in cadence. They laughed, half nervous, half exhilarated. Science, they told themselves, always explained everything in the end. That night, Helen woke to whispering. The sound came from the recorder still running near the tent flap. She pressed her ear close. Beneath the static, something faintly melodic hummed, a child's tone, soft and distant, threaded with the slow beat of the earth. When dawn came, one of the assistants was gone. His tent was zipped open from the inside, bedroll empty. Footprints led toward the ridge and stopped abruptly near a patch of soil darker than the rest. When they dug a few inches, the ground exhaled a warm gust of air, smelling faintly of iron. The recorder nearby captured it, the hiss, the low tone that followed, and something almost like words. Too distorted to pass. They packed and left by noon. Back in Charleston, Helen analyzed the tapes for weeks. The frequency of the hum didn't match any known geological pattern. When slowed down, it formed an irregular rhythm, roughly 60 beats per minute, the average resting heart rate of a 12-year-old child. That detail never made it into her report. She filed the findings as unexplained acoustic interference. She never returned to the ridge. Years passed. People forgot again. The forest thickened, swallowing the road entirely. But stories still drifted through the valleys. Campers who woke to faint vibrations in the ground. Hunters whose compasses spun uncontrollably near the ridge. Hikers who found small footprints in the mud where no children had been. In 1992, a local historian named Michael Caro began researching the abandoned mines of West Virginia. He was a rational man, the kind who loved turning myths into mapped coordinates. When he found records of the Weaver family, Jacob, Mary, and Thomas, he felt the familiar pull of a story too strange to ignore. The county archives held only fragments, an arrest record, a property dispute, a coroner's note that didn't match the cause of death. But tucked between those yellowed pages was something else, an unsigned letter written in neat, slanted script. They touched the ridge again. It remembers. He traced the location, drove there alone, and set up camp at the forest's edge. He recorded everything in his field journal: temperature, wind direction, soil composition. On the second night, he noted vibrations through the ground, subtle but rhythmic. At 3:07 a.m., his audio recorder captured a faint humming pattern followed by a child's voice, calm and clear, whispering his name. The entry after that stops mid-sentence. Rescue teams found his camp 2 days later. The tent was torn open, equipment scattered, but no sign of him. The tape recorder was still running. The last 30 seconds were nothing but deep, steady breathing. The state closed the investigation within a month. Official cause: environmental disappearance, presumed exposure. By the early 2000s, the legend of Thomas Weaver resurfaced online. Paranormal forums buzzed with claims about a breathing hill in West Virginia, a cursed mining site that swallowed anyone who disturbed it. Most brushed it off as fiction, but a few users, locals, warned others not to go. They posted coordinates, blurred photos, audio clips of low-frequency hums. One clip, barely audible, included a whisper at the end. Still here. In 2019, a group of amateur explorers decided to test it. They ran a YouTube channel dedicated to Forgotten America. Cameras strapped to their chests, they hiked up the ridge through thick fog, laughing at the local myths. Around dusk, they reached a clearing where the air felt unnaturally warm. One of them remarked that the ground vibrated underfoot, faint but steady. Their footage shows the moment it changed. The sound of laughter fades. The camera turns sharply, catching a shadow between the trees. Small, human-shaped, unmoving. For a few seconds it appears to be watching them. Then the feed cuts into static. When the camera comes back online, the forest is empty. Only the hum remains. The explorers were never identified. The channel was deleted within hours. Copies of the footage still circulate, grainy and fragmentary, under names like the Breathing Hill Tape and Weaver Footage 2019. Viewers claim that if you listen closely with headphones, you can hear a child humming beneath the static, soft, even unbroken. Locals say the ridge is quieter now, but that's not true. The silence itself hums. You can feel it in your teeth if you stand still long enough. The air grows heavier, pressing down as though the mountain were drawing in breath. And if you stay past sundown, when the fog rolls in from the valley and the trees vanish into the grey, you might see movement at the edge of your light, small, deliberate, calm. Some believe Thomas Weaver never died, that he became something else entirely. The ridge changed him, absorbed him, preserved him as its voice. Others think the boy was never human to begin with, that he was a part of the land all along. A consciousness awakened when men started cutting too deep into what should have been left alone. But those who live nearby don't argue theories. They just keep their distance. The last miner who tried drilling near the ridge in 2021 quit after a week. He claimed the machines shook with a pulse he could feel through the handles, and that the dirt beneath his boots moved like a living thing. When asked what it sounded like, he just stared off toward the hills. That's how the story always ends, with silence, or something pretending to be silence. Every few years, someone new goes missing. Campers, historians, curious travelers. The reports are brief. Last seen near the ridge. Equipment recovered, subject not found. Possible cave-in. The earth offers no explanation. It never has. But those who have lived here long enough know the truth buried under the official reports. They know the rhythm of the land, the way it breathes before the storm. The faint vibration that starts beneath your feet when the night is too still. They know what the miners learned, what the weavers feared, what Eleanor Creswell tried to prove all those years ago. That the ground itself remembers, and that remembering has a cost. So if you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of West Virginia, where the fog hangs low and the trees lean close to the road, roll down your window for a moment. Listen, if you hear it, that low, steady hum rising from beneath the earth, don't stop. Don't turn toward the ridge, because the mountain might already be listening. And somewhere beneath those Appalachian hills, a boy who never blinked is still waiting,